want to get into some economic information, everybody. And this is, I could have used the Repo Man theme on this. Just have to fix the cam a little bit. But this story is a little bit old, but I want to show you how everything is. And this is something that obviously, once you see the headline, your mind will probably go in the same direction. But the story is from NBC News. It's from a couple of weeks ago. Car repossessions are on the rise in warning sign for the economy. Blow that up for you. After auto repossessions tumbled during the pandemic, they are now approaching their pre-pandemic, so-called pandemic levels, with industry analysts worried the trend will continue. All right. I was riding on a concrete slab down a river of useless flab, as Iggy Pop said. That, of course, as I mentioned, ties into the information we've been covering over the past few days, a little bit at a time, sometimes as reminders, sometimes with new information folded in. Biden inflation jumps higher as prices rise at fastest pace in 6 months. At the same time, we also know that the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates, which folds back into the fact that many people are no longer going to be able to handle their car loans if they got variable loans. Now, even if they didn't get variable loans, those higher interest rates are going to depress sales on larger items that require loans. Things like automobiles, things like cars, business startups, anything like that, they are going to get heavily slammed, and the demand for loans is going to go down very, very steeply. Now, why is this all important? Well, of course, we know because inflation has been eating away the substance of our earnings for decades, ever since the Federal Reserve was started. But even before that, when the U.S. government had its own central banks, they would inflate the currency and cause price increases. And again, I have to mention that the term inflation doesn't describe really what they're discussing. What they're discussing are the price increases due to the inflation of the money supply, and that is always inevitable. But with this information, I want to turn now to the American Institute for Economic Research, located about an hour and a half away from here, where I am in southern New Hampshire. And this will go into some of the things that, yes, we've covered some of these things. Biden's China tariffs, continuing the tariffs of Trump, the official word about how much food prices have gone up. And we'll go back to this. This coming from Michael N. Peterson, published yesterday, saw it late last night at AIER. Great work from them. And I don't mean great work as in an Illuminati trigger signal. He writes, quote, "I will make no apologies that we are investing to make America strong, investing in America and American innovation in industries that will define the future, and that China's government is intent on dominating," said President Joe Biden in his State of the Onion address earlier this month. That China theme, there's more to it, and we're going to hit that in just a minute. For a president who campaigned as the antithesis to Trump, I can't think of a better quote reflecting both politicians' mutual visions of a protectionist America. Whereas Trump sought to revitalize America's decaying manufacturing sector under the banner of national conservatism, Biden seeks to do the same, but for the purposes of promoting labor and environmental standards. Of course, they have their excuses, and the result will always be the same: protectionism. As James, for certain favored industries. As James Backus notes, Biden is engaging in, quote, polite protectionism, end quote, trade policy that is equally restrictive, but with a genteel attitude. Since taking office, the Biden administration has already poured hundreds of billions into propping up the domestic production of semiconductors, electric vehicles, heat pumps, batteries, and yes, even electric stoves and appliances. The left hopes that by stimulating these industries, America will be economically self-sufficient while fighting climate change. And of course, if you are a person who listens to the paleoconservatives, you'll hear the same argument about economic self-sufficiency while protecting America's borders, protecting key American infrastructure or key American defense-related industries. That is always the way that it goes. And it's always a similar pattern, or protecting American jobs, and both the Republicans and the Democrats do the same thing on that. But Biden's industrial push will swiftly undermine his party's lofty goals, leaving the rest of us to mend a broken economy. Just as Trump's protectionist policies hurt American consumers, Biden's turnip bat will be as harmful, if not more so, to the American economy. When Japan began subsidizing its own high-tech industries in the late 1970s, and by the way, as a quick aside, I want to mention, now, I've mentioned this once before on the show. If you read Rising Sun by Michael Crichton, and that was before he had his big split with Al Gore, and he came out with what was the novel Michael Crichton did? For Storm of Fear or something like that. It was about the errant claims of climate change. And he just slammed Gore big time in it. But in Rising Sun, that had a lot to do with American-Japanese economics. And in it, Crichton, evidently, he had gotten some tips. He thanked Al Gore at the end, who was then a senator, for giving him the information about how Japanese command and control, he didn't call it that, Japanese economic policy had really helped Japan. At the time, I was reading Reason Magazine, Liberty Magazine. I understood economics, and I knew that what Crichton was discussing there was that the Japanese had banked on the semiconductor, the actual production of chips, as being the future for the economy. They got a little blip. They put a bunch of money into it. They gave loans and all sorts of guarantees and Fed money, just like cylinder type things, and public-private partnerships, and steered the economy towards that, thinking that that was going to be the future. When, of course, people actually participating in the economy should be allowed to decide for themselves what the future is. And the future was not the making of the chips. The future was the thought that went into the items on the chips, and how to make the chips more efficient, how to make programs more efficient. So it turned out that it wasn't the chips that became really high demand. It was the content, the programming that became in very high demand. And the Japanese economy quickly after that tanked. Of course, it happened after the book Rising Sun was released. But this is what he is discussing here. When Japan began subsidizing its own high-tech industries in the late 1970s, a new wing within the Democrat Party, the New Democrats as they were called, advocated for policy that would, they believed, boost domestic industry to prevent Japan and other fast-growing nations like China and West Germany from outstripping America's industrial edge. In their 1982 manifesto, these New Democrats argued that Reagan's emphasis on military spending should be redirected to domestic industry. Fears of again, we got to help the military, we got to help domestic. They're always playing favorites. Fears of low employment and economic obsolescence in a globalized age fueled efforts to implement stronger industrial policy. What governments really needed to do, they believed, was identify emerging industries with boatloads of potential and then pump government money into them. But how can government trade officials, or any individual or small group of industry leaders for that matter, possibly have all the information to effectively control an economy as complex as ours? The challenges that plagued protectionist Democrats in the 1980s are the same as those who agitate for an America First agenda today. Contrary to the grim fears of the New Democrats in the 80s, American manufacturing climbed, reaching its peak in 1990. In fact, U.S. employment rose by almost 19 million between 1980 and 1990. If anything, employment and economic prosperity grew despite industrial nudging, not because of it. The market forces, so derided by protectionist supporters like President Biden, are the very features that generate economic growth. Without markets free from government meddling, there's simply no way individuals, let alone enlightened trade officials, can allocate resources to industries with the highest potential to satisfy customer needs. Even if planning agencies could identify sunrise industries, American producers are still unlikely to compete against more creative, efficient foreign firms. During the Obama administration, ambitious attempts were made to invigorate American solar manufacturing. Those attempts quickly failed. As part of Obama's Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, for example, the government provided a loan guarantee of $535 million to Solyndra Incorporated, an American firm that was championed as the next big producer of high-quality commercial solar panels. It is time to rev up the American innovative machine and reclaim our lead on clean energy, said former U.S. Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu. Sound familiar? 2 years later, in August of 2011, after struggling to remain afloat, Solyndra filed for bankruptcy, just like those rail companies I was mentioning in last night's reading. They filed for bankruptcy. How could the government, you might ask, fail so egregiously? As with most cases of industrial planning, politics and knowledge problems severely limited the ability of the Obama administration to spearhead industrial development. The same applies to Biden's industrial initiative. Now, let's just pull away from that for just a minute and again continue along these economic thought lines. Let's say it's not a direct government pull of tax money from you or from your progeny to give it to Solyndra in some sort of a loan or a guarantee or a grant or anything like that. Let's say it's not a direct public-private so-called partnership, right? Let's say instead it's a tariff against, as I've often mentioned, against foreign washing machines, right? Now, what does that do? That allows the inefficient company that's getting the United States aid, in this case, not direct aid, but they're still going to be getting more American money than they normally would have because now the United States has made the foreign competitor more expensive, right? Now, just to mention again, those people who argue that the United States government got along just fine without the income tax and that there were no problems when the United States operated under the tariff and excise taxes that it had, I'll remind those people of things like the Civil War, things like the whiskey rebels getting trounced because of the excise tax, and things like, the fact that the claim, as Thomas Jefferson errantly claimed, the claim that they balanced the budget without anyone seeing the tax man was false because they still operated with excise taxes and with tariffs, and those tariffs were applied to anybody bringing in imports in the United States. They certainly saw the tax man, and then anybody who bought from them saw the results of the tax man. This is one of the real problems of tariffs. It's an indirect tax. It's applied only to the people who are importing, and it then becomes a favoritist tool to make sure that competition is squandered. So I hope I can stress to people, tariffs are evil, they're bad, and they're economically destructive. And I think it's an error to claim that the United States operated okay under just the tariff paradigm because it didn't. And it wasn't just the tariff paradigm, it also was the excise tax paradigm. And the tariff paradigm is the direct cause of the Civil War. So it certainly wasn't a good idea. Political gamesmanship, he continues, is another consequence of the government attempting to design the future of American industry. One report cites that over a 15-year span, 2/3 of federal subsidies and tax credits went to the largest American corporations. And you can look at tariffs as the same thing. They play the game, including Boeing, $13.4 billion, Intel, $5.9 billion, Alcoa Steel, $5.6 billion, and General Motors, $3.7 billion. Industrial policy requires picking winners and losers, which usually means that incumbent producers benefit at the expense of smaller, more innovative ones. Goliath always wins. Goliath is the government, and then it helps its sub-Goliath. Protectionism also makes goods more expensive. Last year, the Commerce Department doubled the tariff on Canadian lumber, increasing the price of lumber almost threefold since the pandemic. According to the National Association of Home Builders, rising costs of lumber are adding $36,000 to new home prices. That is money that could be spent on other things, on other American businesses, not these special interests. All of those businesses will not be seen now. They don't have a voice in Washington, D.C. They don't have the money to lobby the way the national lumber people can lobby. The last thing we need is more protectionism, he writes, especially with inflation staring us in the face and an economy teetering on the edge of recession. Back in 1981, Senator Joe Biden was closely connected to the biggest players setting the new Democrat agenda. If the past is any indication of the future, this latest rendition of America Incorporated will collapse under its own weight, just as it did 30 years ago. Instead of building back better, Biden's industrial flop will disrupt entrepreneurial activity and hobble the American economy. This is exactly the wrong time to be doing this. This is incredible. Sorry, I just have to turn the heat up. It's really cold here. Yeah, took myself off the cam there. All right, yeah, just playing it as we go here. I had to give that to you. It is an excellent piece, and I hope people will check out Michael Peterson's work. He did a really good job. And of course, right there, you can see he's pursuing his master's in economics from George Mason. So he's in a good spot at George Mason right there. I know a lot of folks over at George Mason who are doing really, really good work. So again, Biden's keeping the tariffs in there. We've seen, as activist post noted, forget the official word. Here's how much the price of food has really gone up. You think food's going to go down under tariffs? No.